Hello everyone, it's Bina 007 here for episode 49 of Vassals of Kingsgrave's Agatha Christie linear reread. Today we're covering 450 from Paddington, also known as What Mrs. McGillicuddy Saw! Also known as Eyewitness to Death. It's a novel that was published in November 1957 and it stars Miss Marple. I have to say, this is not one of my favourite Miss Marple novels. It's even more loosely plotted than the average. Miss Marple novels often don't have that many physical clues and rely on a little bit of a restaging and a confession to get their person. And I find this one frustratingly loose, but it does feature a really wonderful character, a bit of a modern day Mary Poppins called Lucy Islesborough, so it has that as a compensation. The setup of the book is that Mrs. McGillicuddy, a friend of Jane Marple's, is on the 4:50 train coming out of Paddington Station, which is one of the main London train terminals. So if you're heading out to the west of England, you will start your journey then as now from Paddington Station. Apparently there was a little bit of title trauma. Agatha Christie didn't want to pick a title that had an obvious train and an obvious train station so that people could identify the country house in question. And I suspect the American publishers wanted a title that the Americans would know what Paddington Station was. At any rate, we have Mrs. McGillicuddy on the train. She's done some Christmas shopping and she's heading towards Jane Marple. And as her train runs parallel with another, a slower train, for a moment, she sees the shutter of that train roll up and a man, the back of a dark-haired man, strangling a blonde woman in a fur coat. Naturally, Mrs. McGillicuddy is horrified and she calls for the train guard and says, "I've just seen a murder." And when she gets off the train, she also checks to see has he informed the British Transport Police. But because the police have not found a body on that train or anywhere near it, they dismiss Mrs. McGillicuddy as having seen something fanciful and made it up effectively. But Miss Marple is not to be deterred, and she realises she has some good assets when it comes to deducing what really happened. After all, she has the former head of Scotland Yard, Sir Henry Clithering, who absolutely believes in her, and his godson is now a detective inspector. She also has the fact that her nephew's son, David West, works at the British Railways. And she has the fact that, if you remember Murder at the Vicarage, this is a bit of Christieverse stuff for you. Griselda from Murder at the Vicarage, who was having a baby at the end of the novel, that baby's all grows up, and he is an expert on maps. So thanks to the police inspector from A Murder is Announced and the now grown-up boy from Murder at the Vicarage, Miss Marple believes she can thoroughly investigate this murder, thanks also to her last ally, and that is Lucy Islesborough, a character that I'll get into in the main body of the novel because she deserves some time and attention. She's really quite wonderful and cements, I think, Agatha Christie's reputation for creating these phenomenally smart, intelligent, vital female characters that are entirely in charge of their own destiny. So this novel was published in 1957 and Agatha Christie is herself 67, so getting into the age of Miss Marple herself, I suspect. And she continues to document social change in post-war England. The war, although 15, 16 years in the past now, still reverberates. It reverberates through people who served in the war and are now lost and adrift, and those who lost people in the war. We're going to spend a lot of time with the Cracklethorpe family, and here is what someone says of them. Yes, big family it was. The eldest, Mr. Edmund, he was killed in the war. And then there's the brother-in-law of the family, and he did service in the war, lost his wife in childbirth, and is now visiting with his son. This is what is said of Brian Eastley. He reminded her of innumerable young pilots she had known during the war when she had been at an impressionable age of 14. She had gone on and grown up into a post-war world, but she felt as though Brian had not gone on, but had been paused by in the passage of years. His next words confirm this. He had subsided on the kitchen table again. "It's a difficult sort of world," he said, "isn't it? To get your bearings in, I mean. You see, one hasn't been trained for it." Lucy recalled what she had heard from Emma. "You were a fighter pilot, weren't you? You've got a DFC." That's the sort of thing that puts you wrong. You've got a gong, and so people try and make it easy for you, give you a job and all that. Very decent of them, but they're all admin jobs, and one simply isn't any good at that sort of thing. And I think this is a sort of a dilemma and a character that Agatha Christie revisits time and again in her post-war novels. Young men who maybe had a higher than typical risk appetite and maybe weren't cut out for normal civilian life at all. And they do tremendously well in the war, but when they're demobilized, really are, just at sea. And some of them just don't settle and maybe end up taking the wrong path, some the right, but it's a rather dissatisfactory life. We also learn that Lady Stoddart West was a resistance fighter, which is tremendously romantic, but shows the life that women had during the war, quite different from their everyday, normal lives that they have thereafter. She reminds me a little bit of the character of Mrs. Upjohn in Cats Among the Pigeons. And of course, we have some other continuing themes. For example, the rise in the cost of living, and in particular, the scourge of taxation, which I suspect Agatha Christie felt very, very personally. Quote, again she was alone in the first-class carriage. This taxation, thought Miss Marple, that's what it is. No one can afford to travel first class except businessmen in the rush hours. I suppose because they can charge it to expenses. End quote. And here's a quote from Mr. Crackenthorpe. Taxation, don't talk to me of those robbers. A miserable pauper, that's what I am. And it's going to get worse, not better. You wait, my boy. When you get this place, 10 to 1 the socialists will have it off you and turn it into a welfare centre or something, and take all your income to keep it up with. I mean, that probably reflects a little of Mr. Crackenthorpe's obsessions and bigotry, but probably some of Agatha Christie's frustrations too. And then, of course, another continuing theme is the decline of the old country houses. We've seen them turned into nursing homes and schools for young juvenile delinquents in Agatha Christie's novels. Where they're kept in families, it's incredibly rare, and people think it won't last once the incumbents die off. And that's very much the case here with Rutherford Hall. Here's a quotation. The kitchen garden was sketchily cultivated with a few vegetables. The hothouses were in ruins. The paths everywhere were overgrown with weeds. A herbaceous border near the house was the only thing that showed free of weeds and in good condition, and Lucy suspected that had been Emma's hand. End quotation. This reminds me a lot of the ruined garden in Cricket House and the bemoaning of not having enough gardeners to go round. That will come up in Cats Among the Pigeons, that you can find work as a gardener because people are so very desperate. And then we have something of a talk of decolonisation. You've seen that, I think, in previous episodes with the events section, and that continues here. Quote, how delightful for you having brothers with you. So often families are scattered. India, though I suppose that is all done with now. And Africa, the west coast. Such a bad climate, end quote. So, this explicit reference to Indian independence. And actually, even in Africa, the independence movement taking place. So this is a very unstable post-war England, certainly for this class of person who has been very wealthy and maybe feels attacked by some of the social change that comes post-war and must be funded through taxation. We're still in the post-war era, and there's a kind of melancholy tone, I think, because of that, to this novel and many others of this stage of Agatha Christie's writing. Remember also she lost her own son-in-law in the war. This is very, very close to her. Okay, so let's get into the historic context of the novel. Since the last novel was published, which was Dead Man's Folly in October 1956, in November 1956 we have the Hungarian Revolution, where the Hungarians rise up against the Soviet Union, only to then be crushed. We have the Suez Crisis, in which Britain tries to go to war to protect the Suez Canal against the Egyptian revolutionaries, but is incredibly embarrassed when America does not back her. President Eisenhower is re-elected. We have the Melbourne Olympics. Floyd Patterson becomes world heavyweight champion. And Roger Vadim releases And God Created Women, the film starring sex kitten Brigitte Bardot. In January 1957, Saarland joins West Germany. Anthony Eden resigns after the Suez Crisis to be replaced by Harold Macmillan. In February 1957, Bergman's Seventh Seal is released, a phenomenal film. March 1957, the Suez Canal is reopened, and the Treaty of Rome establishes the European Economic Community, the forerunner of the European Union. In July 1957, Lennon and McCartney meet at the St. Peter's Church Hall fete in Wilton. A church fete. How completely Agatha Christian. Reminds me of Dead Man's Folly. And the International Atomic Energy Agency is established. In August 1957, Malaya gains independence from Britain, and Fangio wins his fifth world championship. In September 1957, the Soviet Union launches Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. And a fire at the Windscale nuclear reactor on the northwest coast of England releases radioactive material into the surrounding environment, including iodine 131. Finally, in the month of publication, November 1957, the Soviet Union launches Sputnik 2 with the first animal to orbit the Earth, a dog named Laika. So this is what's going on in the environment. That sort of instability is there in revolutions and decolonization and great technological advances at the same time as uncertainty because it's the Cold War. And so if those advances are from the Soviet Union, how does the West react? So let's now move into the subject of the book. And as always, I will be spoiler free up until the end credits music. As I've just said, we have Miss Marple, the friend of Elspeth McGillicuddy, who are going to investigate this mysterious murder on the train. And we have the wonderful character of Lucy Islesborough. She's a brilliant scholar, a skilled cook, an energetic housekeeper. She actually got a first in mathematics at Oxford, so she's clearly incredibly intelligent, but has decided to make far more money than all of her academic relatives by becoming a housekeeper. And as we said before in that passage about gardeners, it's so difficult to get domestic staff now post-war that if you do still have one of these large country houses, you'll pay almost anything for an efficient and dedicated housekeeper. And that's what she does. She's a freelancer and a very modern, progressive woman. She runs her own destiny. She takes the jobs she pleases at the price she pleases. And it's made very clear that she is going to take this job to be on the ground at Rutherford Hall because it amuses her, because she's intrigued by investigating a murder. She is expensive, but she's doing it for the love of it. Here's a quote from the book. I'll say she is. She scares the life out of me. She's so devastatingly efficient. No man will ever dare marry that girl. Now, I wouldn't say that. It would have to be a special type of man, of course. Miss Marple brooded on this thought a moment. And I sometimes wonder with Lucy Islesborough getting married whether a woman as strong and willful and successful and efficient as Lucy needs a special kind of man in the same way that Agatha Christie needed Max Mallowan. It takes a special kind of secure, confident man to marry a woman as accomplished as Agatha and Lucy. Now, let's get into the family at Rutherford Hall. Because we realise, thanks to our British Transport Police ally and our map reading ally, that the place where the two trains passed was about 10 minutes before it also passed Rutherford Hall, that there's an embankment there which would have been the perfect place for someone to push the body out and for it not to be discovered because it would have been in the woods that bound the estate of the Hall. Now, this also suggests, of course, that the murder was not a crime of opportunity but was premeditated. And that, therefore, in turn, puts the suspicion on the people in the house because, of course, they would know the environment and have access to the grounds. So let's get into the people at the house. They are the Krakenthorpe family, and they are headed by Luther Krakenthorpe, who reminds me, for those of you from the Vassals of Kingsgrave Game of Thrones community, as very like the late Lord Frey. He's an elderly widower. He has a life interest in Rutherford Hall. He doesn't actually own it because his own father, who set up the Krakenthorpe dynasty, didn't trust him. So he left the house and all the trust income bound up very securely for Luther's children so that Luther couldn't sort of fritter it all away. So Luther has therefore become an awful miser. He's very tight with his money and he's taken to his bed and is constantly being attended to by the local GP, the NHS doctor. He reminds me a little bit of Timothy Abernathy in After the Funeral, because you wonder if he's really as sick as he says he is. But he's really an unpleasant man, and one could argue that all of his children would want him dead. There is his son Cedric Krakenthorpe, who is a bohemian painter living in Ibiza. He's the eldest surviving son, so as such he will inherit Rutherford Hall and the surrounding lands that he can sell off to a housing developer and become very rich, as well as a share of the inheritance money. So there's a pot of cash that the children will split equally, but there's also the hall that the eldest son gets. There's Harold Crackenthorpe, who's another one of the sons. He's a married businessman in London. He's got a very aristo wife. He's apparently very wealthy as a financial advisor. And then there's Brian Eastley, who we've come across just before. He's a Royal Air Force pilot. He was married to the other Crackenthorpe daughter, who died in childbirth, and he's got a young son called Alexander. So he does have a share also in the cash out if anything happens to the father, Luther. And he's really just lost, really lost. And Miss Marple describes him in terms that are so similar to Monty, as someone who's just lost his way in life. This is a description she gives. And this is her younger brother, Agatha Christie's younger brother. And as we know, she's always writing novels in which the ne'er-do-well younger brother is redeemed by the love of a good woman. Quote, he went out to East Africa and started a series of cargo boats on the lake out there. Victoria, Nyanza, or is it Albert, I mean? Anyway, I'm sorry to say that it wasn't a success and he lost all his capital. Most unfortunate, end quote. So other characters, we have Alexander Eastley, Brian's son, and his best mate from school, James Stoddart West, and they're home for the holidays. James's mother, Lady Stoddart West, we know is an ex-resistance fighter and is French. We also have Dr. Quimper, the family GP, and we have Detective Inspector Dermot Craddock, who is the godson of Sir Henry Clithering. So we know that he will take Miss Marple seriously. How does the book progress? Well, basically, they're trying to find the body. And Lucy is on the ground at Rutherford Hall, and very quickly she does discover the body. But the problem is that the police can't really identify her, and the family don't admit to knowing her either. So the suspicion really falls on them as to who this woman could be. And to add some mystery into an already mysterious situation, we realise that there's a rumour that the elder son, Edmund, who has already died when the novel opens, claimed that he had met and fallen in love with a French woman during the war. And there's a rumour that he may well have married her and had a child. And if so, that child would be the person who inherits Rutherford Hall. And this mysterious woman, potentially wife, has written a letter to Emma quite recently and said that she's going to make her presence known and she wants her son to be taken care of. So that's also thrown into the mix. Right then, let's get into how this novel reads today for a contemporary reader. Well, of course, there is a bit of low-level racism, not necessarily from Agatha, but from the characters. And this is someone referring to Cedric the painter who lives in Ibiza. Quote, my point is that murder may be an everyday commonplace to you living amongst hot-blooded Latin people. Nevertheless, in England, we take such things seriously, end quote. And there's a fair amount of misogyny. Quote, cocky enough for anything, he said. I don't care for the type myself. A loose-living lot, these artists, and very likely to be mixed up with a disreputable class of women. Craddock smiled. I don't like the way he dresses either, went on Bacon. No respect going to an inquest like that, end quote. Other than that, though, I think it's actually pretty readable. It holds up pretty well. In terms of adaptations, there are 3. So the first is one of the Margaret Rutherford films that was released in 1961, so very shortly after it was published. It was the first of her 4 appearances as Miss Marple, and it was the first Miss Marple film made. We know that Agatha Christie did not love these films at all because they're so different. I mean, they're played for laughs, they're very fun, they're very vivacious, and they take great liberties with the plotting. You know, we have Miss Marple kind of taking on the role of Elspeth McGillicuddy and Lucy and being on hand at the hall. It's quite fun, but it's just not a Miss Marple. So I would encourage you to watch it, but take it with a pinch of salt. There are 2 more straightforward adaptations. The first is part of the BBC's Joan Hickson Marple series, originally airing in 1987. It does come across as rather staid, I think, to a modern viewer, but it is very faithful and very well done. Changes to the plot, there's quite a few actually. I'm not going to go into them just because they're kind of potentially spoilers, but I think the kind of integrity of their overall plotting is kept intact. I do love at the end, though, that Miss Marple says of Lucy Earlsborough that she will marry one of the characters, but she won't fall in love with him for quite some time, probably until they're having their 3rd child, which I thought was rather astute. And then the most recent of the adaptations is the 2004 Marple, made by the rival British channel ITV, starring Geraldine McEwen as Miss Marple. Again, there are quite a few changes made, including Brian being American in the adaptation. It's actually pretty well cast. And again, I think even though changes are made, it keeps to the spirit and the overall outline of the novel. We have Amanda Holden as Lucy Isles Barrow even, John Hannah as the inspector, um, David Warner as Luther Crackenthorpe, which is some wonderful casting, Ben Daniels as Alfred, Charlie Creed Miles as Harold, and wonderfully we have Grief Rhys Jones as Dr. Quimper, and a little cameo appearance from Rob Brydon as Inspector Audrey, so the British transport policeman, and Pam Ferris as Miss Elspeth McGillicuddy. So it really is very wonderful. It's a lovely cast and it zips along. It's probably lighter and frothier than the novel, but I don't mind that. I really do quite like some of these Geraldine McEwen novels. I think she just has this almost cheeky, sprite-like presence about her that I find quite winning. I think it's definitely, put it this way, if you want a combination of faithfulness and fun, then this is the adaptation for you. But as I say, this is not a film or a book that is strong on plotting. That is very typical of Miss Marple's. She often relies on a staging and a forced confession at the end, and we're not in any different position here. Is it worth your while to read? Yes, for the character of Lucy Ellsborough, but I don't think for any other reason. Join me after the end credits music for the solution and the clues. If not, I'll speak to you next time for episode 50, which will be Ordeal by Innocence, an altogether more complicated and troubling novel. Okay, folks, so we're back for the clues and the solutions. So, one of the interesting things about these unhappy family novels is that often the person who did it is not part of the family. And actually, the fact that all of the family have a good motive is part of the red herring, the giant red herring. And in this category, you can think of novels such as Appointment with Death, Hercule Poirot's Christmas, and After the Funeral. So the person who done it is actually Dr. Quimper, because is he in love with Emma? I would hope he's in love with Emma, but I think he's also in love with the position of having money and maybe even Rutherford Hall if he plays his cards right. And the key to why he commits the murders is twofold. He wants to marry Emma, but he previously contracted a marriage to a woman who is a Catholic and so does not believe in divorce, won't grant him a divorce. And so he murders her on the train and gets rid of her body by putting it in the casket in Rutherford Hall. So that makes it possible for him to marry again and he will not be a bigamist. The other murders are related to the fact that the will has been constructed very cleverly by Luther's father, and it's a form of tontine. So the word tontine is a clue here. And what that means is that the income from Luther will be divided amongst his living heirs. So therefore, the more of the siblings of Emma who die, the more money is going to come to Emma. Insofar as there are clues, I think it's the discovery of the fact that the will is structured as a tontine, because that helps you with the motivation. I guess the clue is that Quimper loves Emma, so even though he's not family, maybe we should consider him to be a beneficiary of the will, ultimately. We know that Stodder's mum is French, so she's going to potentially have a link to all of this. And Mrs. Kidder, at some point, so she's the cook, mentions bigamy. So how does he affect these murders, Dr. Quimper? Well, the whole family is poisoned from arsenic in the curry, but yet Alfred is the one who died because Dr. Quimper is treating them. And so he can further poison him with the medicine. Harold dies from a refill prescription that's been issued by Dr. Quimper. And, it's kind of done a bit weirdly off screen, but effectively he is a bit surprised because he thought he'd finished taking all his medicine. So that should alert us to the fact that why does he have a refill? And I guess that for those of us who are astute, we should be aware that there is a category of Agatha Christie murders. Not only is there the category of unhappy families, but it's not the family who did it. There's also a category of Agatha Christie's wherein a spouse is killed to make way for another marriage. And I'm thinking now of things like Three Act Tragedy and Lord Edgware Dies. And the latter in particular, a Catholic who won't grant a divorce. There are, of course, lots of red herrings. I mean, the letter that's written apparently from Martine to the family is there to implicate the family in case anything goes wrong. There is Martine, the missing ballerina, but no, she's alive and well in the Caribbean. And then, of course, the fact that Stodder's mum is implicated in this whole thing as well. So I find that bit kind of really ridiculous and sort of, it's just like such a coincidence, coinky dink. But ultimately, I suppose the plot does hang together. The Dr. Quimper motivation, I guess, is there. I didn't find any of it particularly believable or convincing, or I didn't really care about any of those characters. I found Lucy Aylesborough to be quite fun. And it kind of, there's a lot of padding. Like there's this whole sequence where the guy who's the financier goes back to London and we see the aristocratic wife, and it just feels like so much padding. The middle third of this book is really slow. Anyway, I hope that's been a little bit enlightening. I wouldn't necessarily recommend 450 from Paddington, but I hope you'll tune in next time for Audial by Innocence, because I do think that's a slightly more, well, not necessarily a better book, but it's certainly darker and more mysterious. At any rate, if you want to get involved in the discussion, join us on the Vassals of Kingsgrave Discord channel and leave a comment on our YouTube posts. Thank you for listening. Thank you.